This video took 2.5 weeks to produce, totaling 17 minutes and 28 seconds, to give you an immersive narration of Wild Leo's entire process of building 8 shelters over 2 months in the wilderness. If you can't sleep at night, then he is absolutely the miracle cure for your insomnia. In a snowy mountain valley, Leo, who hadn't been seen for a long time, had already hiked 10 li, about 5 kilometers. The heavy pack made his backache and his legs cramp, so he stopped by a small lake, planning to make do for the night. Old Lee skillfully spread out his tent. Using the convenience of 2 trees, he quickly set up the shelter. He specifically reinforced the surroundings with ground stakes, pulling the windproof ropes tight, afraid of a surprise attack from the wind. But Leo wasn't in a hurry to relax. Instead, he took out a shovel and reinforced the area around the shelter with snow. After all, the wind here was incredibly strong, and more protection was necessary. Next, the heating stove was assembled in Old Lee's hands. This was second nature to him. He could do it perfectly with his eyes closed. Outside, the wild wind was still raging. A fallen bare tree became his target. It was dragged back to the shelter to receive Old Lee's special attention. The axe in his hand was powerful, and soon a small mountain of firewood was piled up. The river here hadn't completely frozen over yet. He scooped some water and returned to the shelter. Although it was a world of ice and snow, the scenery was genuinely beautiful. Besides the falling snowflakes, everything else seemed frozen like a sculpture, completely still. As soon as it got dark, the temperature plummeted. He quickly closed up shop and started a small fire. Although the tent was battered by the wind, he calmly prepared his dinner. Never mind the taste, the variety of food was impressive. The small pot could barely hold it all. After heating it up, Leo began to eat his delicious meal. But the howling wind made him uneasy, truly afraid that a moment of carelessness would see his tent uprooted. With an anxious heart, he finished his meal in a few bites. Afterwards, he tightened his hammock and laid out layers of bedding. As soon as he closed his eyes, he wouldn't care if the sky fell outside. The next day, Leo and his little nest were both fine. It was just that the stove's chimney pipe had given out. He had to use a gas stove as a temporary replacement. Sipping on plain boiled water, the view outside was like a high-definition wallpaper, making his heart bloom with joy. Then, with a slap on his thigh, he decided to leave, heading towards the next unknown destination. This journey was another 100 li or so. From the beautiful lakeside scenery, he ventured deep into the forest. A wide, flat clearing caught his fancy. Since few people ever set foot here, the snow on the ground looked unremarkable, but was actually several meters deep. After marking out a piece of land, Old Lee began his digging campaign. Though last night's blizzard didn't harm him, it left him with some lingering fear. So this time, he planned to hide in a pit, which would at least give him a greater sense of security. In no time, Old Lee had dug a pit for himself. He put on his snowshoes and walked nearby. A dead, bare tree stood straight, but Old Lee showed no mercy. After a bit of work, it was dragged back to the shelter and became the beams for his underground shelter. Because sealing it completely would feel strange, he only covered the area above his bed and then backfilled it with snow. A shelter where you could lie down and gaze at the stars was complete. The remaining parts of the dead tree were not wasted. He sawed them into small sections to be used as firewood. His stomach was already growling with hunger. He quickly skewered some meat to roast and boiled some pumpkin soup, a well-balanced meal. The moon had quietly risen high in the sky, reminding Leo that it was time to sleep early. The fire in the stove burned all night. When he woke up the next morning, he found a large hole burned into the ground. But this didn't spoil his mood for enjoying the scenery. He always thought there were many more places waiting for him. So, without eating, he packed his bags and continued his adventure. As fate would have it, he wandered to another small lakeside. The green pine trees stood out in the white world. The snow was falling harder and harder. Old Lee stopped being picky and decided to set up camp right there. As usual, after clearing the way with a snow shovel, the familiar tent made its appearance. In a short while, his shelter stood tall in the snow. All his belongings were temporarily brought inside, and the stove was installed. Once the stove was assembled, the tall chimney stretched out of the tent, like a flag for his shelter. Besides an endless supply of water, there were countless trees nearby, especially the fallen ones. Old Lee's eyes lit up at the sight. Without a second thought, he started hauling them back. Sitting at the entrance of his home and working on them was incredibly comfortable. The snow outside fell heavier and heavier. It was time for Old Lee to close his door and start his nightlife. By now, he had stockpiled enough firewood. Only after the flames were lit did he begin to prepare dinner. The vegetables prepared 3 days ago were still fresh, paired with some special cured meat he'd been saving since the new year. Although it wasn't exquisitely plated and the colors weren't that vibrant, it didn't stop Old Lee from eating with great relish. But tonight's bed was special. The soft mattress would surely help him sleep well. He was exhausted from all the walking these past few days. So, under the glow of the stove fire, Old Lee fell asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. The next day, the chimney was still puffing smoke. Outside was a world of ice, but inside, it was warm as spring. The clear weather illuminated everything around. The scenery was simply enchanting, making even the well-traveled Old Lee stop and stare for a little longer. He went back inside, boiled a pot of hot tea, and took his small stool to wander by the lake. The small fish in the water were swimming in schools, as if having a meeting. Old Lee slapped his forehead, regretting not bringing a fishing rod. Otherwise, it would have been another bountiful day. Across the ocean, in the forests of the beautiful United States, our guest Leo strolled along. Any random tree here was over 100 years old. Looking at the big trees above and the ground below, Old Lee decided to set up camp. He put down his heavy gear and first cleared the hidden branches on the ground. Then he took out his ancestral tent from his bag and prepared to set it up. First step, the four corners of the tent had to be firmly secured with stakes. The snow was still falling gently, and the cold wind occasionally caused trouble. But Leo was unfazed. Under his hands, the tent slowly took shape. After he tied the windproof ropes tightly and set up the door curtain and canopy, his one-bedroom, one-living-room setup in the wild was complete. He quickly brought his luggage inside. In this freezing weather, the first thing to do was, of course, to get the small stove going. Years of life in the wild made him an expert. Old Lee admired the snowscape outside while assembling the stove. Before long, the long chimney was firmly attached to the stove. He also secured it tightly with windproof ropes, afraid the mischievous cold wind would cause trouble. Old Lee walked past the century-old trees and finally set his sights on a fallen tree trunk. With a few swift moves, 2 bare logs were his. He returned to his temporary shelter like he was carrying 2 trophies. He made several trips back and forth like this, harvesting many small logs. Then, like an experienced carpenter, he sawed each piece of wood to the right length. He also remembered to chop and split some of them into even thinner strips. Only when a corner of the tent was full did he nod with satisfaction. Next, he unfolded a blue moisture-proof mat. A large mattress was also assembled in his hands. After working for half a day, Old Lee could finally sit down and take a deep breath. After a short rest, Old Lee started to inventory the gear in his backpack. The heavy snow started falling again outside, and the temperature dropped. Seeing this, he quickly stuffed dry wood into the stove and lit the fire in the most direct way. Listening to the crackling sound from the stove, Old Lee fell into deep thought. Coming back to his senses, he cleaned the snow from inside and took down the door curtain. After all, the precious heat couldn't be allowed to escape. The fire in the stove burned brighter, and the shelter warmed up. He took out a large iron pot to make something good to eat. Vegetables, chopped before he left home, were stir-fried in the pot, and slices of meat joined the party, filling them air with a fragrant aroma. After combining the two, Old Lee sprinkled some cheese slices on top and served it with a few pieces of bread. A hearty dinner was ready. Sitting in the warm room, he ate with great enjoyment. After eating his fill, he took the air mattress and started blowing it up. Then, he slipped into his sleeping bag and slept soundly. At 6:30 in the morning, it was still pitch black outside. Old Lee was already dressed and ready to welcome the new day. The snow had been falling all night, and the small tent had completely blended into the landscape. He took a small pot and collected the freshest snow. Cuddled by the stove's fire, it would soon turn into sweet drinking water. Once the water boiled, he tossed in a packet of 82 coffee. Then, in the cleared space, he placed an iron pot. Wild eggs, already beaten, were poured into the pot and quickly scrambled into golden yellow eggs. Although scrambled eggs are a common dish, enjoying them against such a snowy backdrop was a unique experience. Just after he finished breakfast, the snow began to fall even harder. Old Lee's heart skipped a beat. He felt something was wrong, so he quickly packed his bags, ready to run. With the warmth from his recent meal, his movements were incredibly fast. The tent was quickly stuffed into his backpack. Once everything was packed, he set off for the next unknown destination without a backward glance. In the deep forests of Freljord, Old Lee pulled a large load of belongings like an old ox. The snow, which came up to his thighs, made things even worse. Finally, in a relatively open area, he took out his gear. He used a long tool to measure the snow's depth. He hadn't expected it. The snow was 2.25 meters deep, only a little shorter than Yao Ming. Even the trees were laden with snow, on the verge of collapsing. Afterwards, Old Lee quickly got to work. This was a new tent he had recently acquired, with a huge amount of space. Besides the amazing space, it was also exceptionally easy to set up. Having just measured the snow depth, he decided to fully develop this fertile ground to build a safer and warmer shelter. First, he dug a boundary according to the size of the tent, then shoveled the snow out, one scoop at a time. Luckily, it was soft and light snow. If it had been hard soil, Old Lee estimated he'd be digging until the next century. Even so, this ice pit about 1.2 meters deep. Took a full 3 hours to complete. Next, the huge tent needed to be stretched over the deep pit, covering it perfectly. A castle-like shelter took shape. For those who have built many shelters, they know that such a ceiling height, he had to extend the chimney so it could smoothly reach the roof. By the time he was done, it was already 5 o'clock. Old Lee realized he had to act quickly. A small dead tree became his target. Although it took some effort to saw it down, its intricate branches were tangled together, making it difficult to pull free. He finally managed to carry it to the shelter before dark. The biting cold of the night made Old Lee shiver. He had to grit his teeth and persevere. Just sawing it into small sections wasn't enough. He also had to split them into smaller pieces. Everyone yearns for the freedom of outdoor camping, but the hardships are unavoidable. After stacking the firewood properly, he closed the shelter's door. It was a double-layered tent, so it was hard to imagine how warm it would be once the stove was lit inside. In such an airtight space, Old Lee dared not be careless. Carbon monoxide poisoning was no joke, so he always carried a detector, keeping a constant eye on the air quality inside. The fire in the stove burned brightly. Feeling the heat, he took off his thick coat. Various ingredients were already mixed in the pot. His cooking skills looked impressive. For those of you still awake, how about getting up for a late night snack? After a full meal, it was time for a good night's sleep. With so many layers of bedding, even without the warmth of the stove, he wouldn't feel a hint of cold. The next day, the stove was still chugging away. Outside, the snow continued to fall. After one night, Old Lee's shelter was safe and sound. By now, he had already brewed himself a fragrant cup of coffee. After being cooped up all night, he could finally come out for some fresh air. But it was also time to pack up and head to the next location. They say it's better to share joy than to enjoy it alone. This time, Old Lee brought his girlfriend, Xiao Mai, into the snowy woods. Wilderness survival isn't exclusive to men. Women can also hold up half the sky. Pitching the tent, setting up camp, Xiao Mai was quick and efficient, not hesitating at all. The falling snow added a romantic filter to the young couple. After all the windproof ropes were tightened and secured, Old Lee used snow to tightly seal the perimeter of the camp. These two worked fast. In just a few moves, their little shelter was complete. Next, they had to venture deep into the snowy forest to find firewood for warmth. Dry trees were always the first choice. Not only does it protect the green forest, but dry wood is also much easier to burn. Crucially, it's also light. Even Xiao Mai could carry it and run. Old Lee had intended to handle the rest of the work himself, but Xiao Mai insisted on helping. The sight made Old Lee keep his distance, continued his lonely walk in an unknown wilderness. They say, the bigger the storm, the more valuable the fish. This guy loved to wander out when the wind and snow were at their strongest. Despite the lush trees around, the temperature here was pitifully low. So Old Lee decided not to carry his heavy load any further. He chose a clearing and prepared to set up camp. Many fallen trees nearby reminded him that the weather here was unpredictable and harsh. But Old Lee didn't pay them any mind. He skillfully unfolded his camping tent. Once the windproof ropes were pulled and the stakes were hammered into the ground, it was as stable as a mountain. Although the interior wasn't large, once he assembled the small stove and extended the chimney outside the tent, he could enjoy spring-like warmth, even with the biting wind outside. Of course, before that, he had to take out his ancestral saw. The fallen trees in the vicinity became his targets. He chose a few sturdy ones and dragged them back to his campsite. Then, he processed them. The scenery here was truly nice. Besides the vast forest, there was a large river flowing nearby. It was just that the biting wind made it hard for Old Lee to open his eyes. He had to speed up his work. Through his efforts, the prepared firewood was piled up inside the shelter. Afterwards, he went to the river to fetch some of life's source. Without stopping, he went back into the shelter. Old Lee had seen many grand scenes in the wild, but the current gale still made him a bit nervous. He quickly lit a small flame to calm his uneasy heart. Then, he closed the shelter's main door. He wouldn't care if the sky fell outside. With fire, he could prepare some food to fill his stomach. He reheated some fries he had made at home, and then stir-fried some onions and sliced meat. Although it didn't look amazing, it didn't stop Old Lee from eating with great relish. After eating his fill, he dived into his sleeping bag and slept soundly like a silkworm. When he woke up the next day, he began to dismantle the shelter he had stayed in for a night. This guy was always eager for new challenges. After packing up, he strode towards the next location. Walking along, Old Lee plunged deep into the forest. The snow, which came up to his waist, made every step difficult. To save some energy, he spotted a clearing and decided to set up camp on the spot. Old Lee first stomped around vigorously, packing the soft snow until it was as solid as a concrete floor. After marking out his own little territory, it was time for the tent, lifesaver in the cold winter. Then he discovered some wild firewood on the trees, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to last the night. Before it got completely dark, he busied himself for a while and collected a lot of firewood. This time, the small stove was large enough. It was stuffed full of wood. Once the small flame was lit, the shelter slowly warmed up. On this trip, he brought a new gadget, a small device that could measure wind speed and temperature. Old Lee placed it in front of the door, where it looked like a guard standing watch for him. By now, the indoor temperature had risen above zero. A heat-powered fan was placed on the stove. This way, the indoor heat could circulate better. Once everything was ready, Old Lee began to prepare his dinner for the day. Spaghetti with vegetables and sausage. Tonight's dinner looked much more appetizing. With some toasted bread, Old Lee ate heartily. After preparing his bed, it was time to say goodnight to everyone. The heat from the stove continued to radiate. When he woke up the next day, the outside was a vast expanse of white. Everything was quiet. Because he accidentally woke up late, he didn't have time for breakfast and quickly packed his gear to head back. Otherwise, he would miss the number 2 bus home.